Okay, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to talk about today in this video about respiration is we're going to be looking at gas exchange. So because gas exchange can be a little bit complicated, we're not going to go into too much detail, but you guys should know about the basics of it. So essentially what respiration is, how our body responds to it, how our chemicals change based on the partial pressures that we're experiencing inside of our bodies as we exchange gases from the outside atmosphere. So with respiration, so let's just talk about gas exchange. With respiration, there are two integral processes, two things that you always do when you do respiration. There is the external respiration, which is essentially the breathing, right? When you're breathing in and out. So with this respiration that we have here, this external respiration, a lot of people get that confused, or they think that because we have respiration occurring, uh, that there's, you're just breathing, right? But respiration also includes what's going on in your cells, cellular respiration. So when we talked about at the very beginning of the year, when we reviewed about the process of respiration, where we take glucose, 6H12O6, plus we add some carbon or oxygen, it gives us CO2, water, and ATP. Okay, so this process that happens inside of our cells is also respiration. So we have to talk about both when we're talking about the respiratory system because it does regulate both. So with gas exchange, let's talk about external first. So external gas exchange, you're going to have essentially pulmonary ventilation, so that's what we call breathing. That's the fancy term for it. Gas diffusion, so as you're breathing in the oxygen, carbon dioxide is diffusing across your cellular membranes inside of the alveoli in your lungs. So the diffusion is going to occur across the membranes and the capillaries that are connected and surrounding your alveoli. And then this type of exchange also includes the transport of movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So again, your capillary bedside exchange there. So with pulmonary ventilation, okay, this is the physical movement. So when you think about your lungs contracting and reacting to changes in pressure from your diaphragm contracting and relaxing, that's the physical movement. So if I take a deep breath, it smells like cat, you are going to get essentially a pulmonary ventilation. And so this provides you then with alveolar ventilation, so the place where we're going to be exchanging gases between our alveoli and the capillary beds that surround it, and then allow that to go back to our heart, to our circulatory system to be transported. The other thing about air and how we're getting pulmonary ventilation, it deals with the weight of the air, so the content of the air. And there are several different things that can do to the physiology. So depending upon the composition of the air where you're at, if it's high or low in oxygen, if it's high and low in CO2, if the pressures changes, say like if you're on an airplane or at a higher elevation versus a place that's low elevation like sea level, this can influence your ability for pulmonary ventilation and efficiency of it. So with airflow, right, when we're talking about elevation, pressure is extremely important. If you do not have pressure that is allowing for you to have changes between your thoracic cavity and the outside, this airflow that's at the that's going between this gas exchange is going, it's just not going to happen. So airflow is going to go from an area that's high pressure to an area that's much lower in pressure, right? Air is going to go from try to even out the pressure. So we want like high is going to go to low, sort of like diffusion, right? The particles are want to go from the area of high concentration, which corresponds to a high pressure, to an area of low concentration, which corresponds to a lower pressure. And so as you go from inhalation to exhalation, you are going through the cycle of changing your pressure. You're going from an area of high to low, or changing the volume inside of your chest, creating a higher pressure, which allows the air to leave. So expiration. So inspiration, what we're doing is we're lowering the pressure inside of our cavity. Air is able to go in. During exhalation, we're increasing the pressure, and that's going to force air out. So with pulmonary ventilation, the changes in volume, changes in our thoracic cavity are going to influence that flow. So like I said, as we open up our ribs and our diaphragm, so our external as our external intercostals and external intercostals react and change the volume of our chest. Sorry, someone came in. So again, as our intercostals react and change the volume of our chest, our diaphragm is going to contract and expand and going to change the volume overall. So essentially we're creating a wider cavity this way because we're having expansion in our chest, as well as our abdomen is expanding lower because our diaphragm is being pulled down and creating a larger cavity. So by increasing the volume inside of our cavity, as our volume goes up, so essentially the trend here when it goes with pressure and volume, right, as your volume goes up, right, pressure is going to go down. And so as volume increases, pressure goes down. So then if you lower the volume, right, pressure is going to go up because you are not having any place for those particles to go. So when the particles get more compact, the pressure goes up. So the volume of our thoracic cavity changes, and so that's going to end up leading to us going through respiration. So if we're at rest, right, our muscles are going to be sitting doing their thing, right? But as our diaphragm changes, right, from our initial pressure, so if you look here, right, this is our initial pressure, right, then it's going to our change from movement. So again, if we inhale, what we're going to get is we're going to get an expansion of our chest, so our intercostals will relax, we'll pull up with our scalene muscles, which we didn't go over those when we looked at our chest, but then the muscles that are connecting the outer portion of our rib. Pectoralis muscles are going to contract, again, expand the chest cavity, our abdominals get out, and then we also have a change in our diaphragm. So our diaphragm, when it's going to relax here, is going to open up and create a larger cavity. So then what that'll allow is for pressure from the outside of our heart, or sorry, outside of our body, come in through our trachea to our bronchi and into our lungs and cause them to expand, right? So you're decreasing the pressure essentially inside of your alveoli, which allows them to balloon up. With exhalation, all that stuff is changing, so it's the opposite. So with exhalation, our muscles are contracting, our cavity is getting smaller, rectus abdominals aren't going to contract as much anymore, and that cavity is going to shrink. So when that cavity shrinks, we're going to have decreased airflow, decreased movement inside and out of our bodies, and then we're going to get a smaller cavity and thus higher pressure. So that's going to force air out. So compliance, so all this is an indicator of essentially how well you are able to do this, so how well your lungs are able to expand and contract. So a low compliance requires a much greater force, right? If you have low compliance, you're going to have much greater pressure acting on your lungs in order for them to change shape and expel your air. If you have high compliance, that means that you're breathing pretty easily, that your lungs are able to expand and contract pretty straightforward. And there are several things that can influence whether or not your lungs are going to work as well as they should. So these are factors that affect compliance. So if you have issues with your lungs, like you've had inflammation or emphysema, that can cause scar tissue to build up. So you don't have as much smooth or flexible tissue in there, less muscle, more connective tissue, so your lungs don't expand and contract as well. Surfactant production, so like if you have mucus in your lungs, that can influence compliance. So if you like are stopped up, that can cause your lungs not to expand and contract as easily. And then mobility, so if you have like very weak abdominal muscles or if you have weak chest muscles, that can influence how big or small your chest can get. There are other factors that can affect compliance, like if you smoke or drink alcohol. Those things can influence the elasticity in your lungs. Also, like if you don't work out as much, you can get more breathy, you have a harder time for expanding that cavity because your muscles aren't as strong. So that can again cause issues with compliance or the ability for your body to force this. So modes of breathing, this is just essentially how we classify respiratory movement. And this is essentially by patterns of your muscle activity. This isn't like a huge big deal to know, but I want you to kind of hear about it because it's interesting, especially important for those of you that are interested in pursuing like physical therapy or pursuing athletic training. So this is what we'll look for sometimes if we want to make sure an athlete is breathing as effectively, if they're taking the right breaths, if your pacing is good with your breathing to help increase your oxygen levels during working out. But with quiet breathing, that's what we call eupnea. So what this it does, it involves just kind of active and passive inhalation. So this is kind of like your resting breathing. So essentially you're like actively inhaling and then you're just kind of letting it breathe out slowly and doing this thing. If you're doing deep breathing or diaphragmatic breathing, so you're like taking a deep breath, you're changing your diaphragm shape, you're focusing on the movement there. So that's like breathing from your gut. So if you're like breathing from your belly, you're like, take a deep breath, you're like, all right, that's diaphragmatic breathing. So you're using your diaphragm to change that breathing. And this is what you do, like if you want to do relaxing breathing, you'll take deep breaths to your stomach, kind of push your stomach and your abdominal cavity out. Costal breathing is shallow breathing. So someone who is like exercising very quickly or doing some rapid kind of movements, they'll often do these quick, short bursts to try to encourage as much oxygen as possible. So it's not necessarily the most efficient way to breathe, especially if you're running. But the shallow breathing, people who are panicking, sometimes you'll notice this. People who are having injuries will have more shallow breathing. Right? It's a response to try to encourage as much oxygen flow in your body as possible. But this is mainly your rib cage moving, so costal breathing is there. So lung volume. So we will, if at the end of the year, we'll try to do this lab where we'll look at lung volume capacities. But what this is where we're looking at rates and how our volumes are going to change. So with respiratory systems, they're often going to adapt depending upon how much oxygen your body needs and how much oxygen is available. So people that are living in areas where there's less oxygen will oftentimes have a higher breathing rate because they need to get as much oxygen as they would normally or need to function as efficiently as possible. So this is just the number of breaths that you take per minute. So people that have a high respiratory rate, they often may be smaller because they need to get because they're metabolizing faster. You could be exercising, that increases your respiratory rate, so that can change over time. And then the other thing that we measure that we can actually look at is we look at tidal volume. So this is the volume of air that moves between your breath. So you can get your average tidal volume, you can get your max tidal volume. So you can see like how much you do on average versus how much you're able to do if you take like a deep breath. So like your tidal volume, if you just go, is going to be very different than if you're just breathing normally. Okay. So what this graph right here shows is what we can do and actually visualize when we're looking at tidal volume. We can look at the volume that we're going to see between like your resting tidal volume, so what you're doing during normal breathing, how much you can express at a single time, what your maximum is what this large peak is, how fast you can express it. So there's a whole bunch of things that you can measure, and they will do this, like if you do a stress test, for example, if you're, say, someone who might be having chest pains or you're doing physical therapy trying to get back to a healthy breathing rate, especially if you had like injury to your lungs or a lung collapse, they'll look at these things to see if your lung has got back to its normal function. And then there's other things you can measure, like what's called vital capacity. So essentially, how much air you can take in at your max and release. So vital capacity, it just depends on how we're reading these different parts of your wave. Essentially, we call it looks like a wave, but chart to get like how much lung your capacity you actually have. So what's your inspirational capacity, and also your residual functional capacity. How much oxygen is actually still in your blood vessels while we're doing exchange, because that does influence how much oxygen, how much breath you do take. So like for males, for example, they often have a larger residual volume. They often have a larger functional capacity than females do, just because of men being bigger. That's part of the reason why, is that they have a larger chest capacity. So men can usually take a much larger breath than a woman can. And so that's just, again, a sexual trait that exists between men and women. So we can do function tests to essentially test for this to see rates of air fluid and movement that exist there. So I'm going to stop the video there. That's just kind of a brief overview of breathing in general. The idea that if you're increasing your oxygen, if you want to increase your oxygen content where you breathe, and you do that by changing the volume of your chest cavity. So expanding your chest cavity increases the volume, which lowers the pressure, which allows air in. And then if you're breathing out, you decrease the pressure, decrease the size of your cavity, so decreasing the volume, that increases the pressure, and that forces the air out. So if you have questions on that, please let me know. All right, so good luck on that. So your next video, I'm going to talk about gas exchange and a little bit more detail about partial pressure.